The first time I realized my company no longer belonged to me was not in a courtroom or a boardroom. It was at my own dining table. I was 33 years old, still wearing my blazer from work, when my husband slid a folder across the table and said, casually, "My mom thinks it's safer if you step back for a while." Safer. That word landed harder than anything else. Before I tell you how that sentence ended my marriage, nearly erased my career, and started the quietest revenge of my life, pause here for a second. If you've ever trusted someone with your future and watched them rearrange it without your consent, stay with me. Like the story, subscribe if you want to hear how this unfolds, and keep listening, because this didn't start with betrayal. It started with love that slowly learned how to control. My name is Elena Brooks. At the time this happened, I was the founder and CEO of Larkspur Health Systems, a healthcare analytics company based in Denver, Colorado. We built compliance software for mid-sized hospital networks. 12 years of education, 7 years of grinding, 3 rounds of funding, 46 employees, and annual revenue just over $19 million. I built it before I met my husband. I scaled it while married to him, and I almost lost it because I trusted his family more than I trusted my instincts. I met Daniel Brooks at a charity fundraiser 6 years earlier. He worked in corporate sales, charming in a practiced way, the kind of man who listened just long enough to repeat your words back with concern. He admired my ambition openly, said things like, "I don't feel threatened by strong women," which should have been my first warning. His mother, Patricia Brooks, entered my life quietly but decisively. She was a retired hospital administrator, impeccably dressed, permanently composed, and deeply invested in everyone else's decisions. She called it guidance. She called it experience. I called her supportive. At first, Patricia liked to remind people that she understood healthcare better than most. She asked sharp questions at dinners, smiled when executives deferred to her, and told me often how proud she was that I'd built something real. But there was always an addendum. "You're brilliant, Elena, but you don't have to carry everything alone." That sentence followed me everywhere. The small thing that tipped the first domino was a board dinner. We were negotiating a strategic partnership with a hospital group in Phoenix. The deal was delicate, regulated, and time-sensitive. I'd prepared the pitch myself. Daniel insisted on attending. Patricia asked to join. "She's just sitting in," Daniel said, "for support." At the dinner, Patricia didn't sit quietly. She corrected me twice, once on a reimbursement detail, once on a compliance timeline. Both times she was wrong. Both times she smiled afterward, like she'd saved me from myself. The executives noticed. Afterward, Daniel told me I'd been defensive. "You embarrassed my mom," he said, not looking at me. That was new. A week later, our lead investor requested a governance review. He framed it politely. Oversight, structure, stability. Patricia offered to help. "She's done this before," Daniel said. "Why fight it?" I didn't fight it. That was my mistake. Within 2 months, Patricia was an unofficial advisor. Within 4, she was attending executive calls. By month 6, Daniel was forwarding emails between my board and his mother that I hadn't been copied on. When I confronted him, he sounded wounded. "I'm just trying to protect you," he said. "You've been under so much stress." Stress. Another word used to make decisions for me. The day I lost control officially was the day of the emergency board meeting. I wasn't told it was happening until 30 minutes before it started. When I walked into the conference room, my chair was at the side, not the head of the table. Patricia sat across from me. Daniel sat beside her. The board chair, a man named Victor Hale, cleared his throat. "Elena," he said, "given recent concerns, we think it's best if Daniel steps in as interim CEO." Interim. My ears rang. Patricia reached across the table and touched my hand. "This is temporary," she said softly. "You need rest." I looked at Daniel. He didn't meet my eyes. I asked one question. "Who voted for this?" Victor hesitated. "The majority." That was when I understood. They hadn't pushed me out. They'd reclassified me. Advisor. Founder. Visionary. Anything except decision-maker. By the time the meeting ended, my access had been restricted. Financial approvals rerouted. HR reporting changed. My title remained, but my authority evaporated. That night at the dining table, Daniel slid the folder toward me. Inside was a revised operating agreement. My shares diluted, voting power reassigned, temporary authority transferred. "You already signed this," I said. Daniel swallowed. "We signed it. As a family." That word again. I realized then that I hadn't been outmaneuvered by investors or regulators. I'd been domesticated. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I nodded, folded the document, and placed it back in the folder. "Okay," I said. Daniel looked relieved. Patricia smiled. They thought compliance meant defeat. They didn't understand something critical about me. I build systems for a living, and systems leave trails. As I went upstairs that night, I wasn't thinking about divorce or lawsuits. I was thinking about timestamps, version histories, witness obligations, and one clause Patricia had insisted we keep because it looked harmless. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Because when people underestimate you, they stop hiding, and I was about to let them show me everything. What they didn't know yet was that stepping back gave me a vantage point I'd never had before. And from that angle, their entire plan was exposed. The morning after I stepped back, I arrived at the office before anyone else, not out of habit, out of clarity. Larkspur Health Systems occupied the 4th and 5th floors of a glass building near downtown Denver. I'd signed the lease myself 6 years earlier, negotiating a clause that allowed founder access regardless of title. At the time, it felt symbolic. That clause was the reason my keycard still worked. I poured coffee in the empty kitchen and opened my laptop. The system welcomed me like nothing had changed. That was the first quiet relief. I didn't go looking for evidence. I went looking for patterns. I'd spent most of my career mapping how data moved through hospitals. Who touched it? Where it slowed? Where people cut corners? Corporate betrayal isn't emotional at its core. It's procedural. It lives in workflows and approvals and assumptions. At 8:17 a.m., an email came in from Daniel Brooks. Subject: updated roles moving forward. He wrote like a man trying to sound gentle. He thanked me for being understanding. He reassured me that my vision mattered. He said Patricia Brooks had agreed to mentor him through the transition. He promised this was temporary. He ended with, "We're doing this for you." I didn't reply. At 9:02, my calendar updated automatically. Meetings removed. Decision checkpoints reassigned. A recurring executive review I'd run for 3 years now listed Daniel as host. Patricia was added as an observer. Observer was a lie. I joined the first meeting anyway. Daniel looked surprised to see me. Patricia didn't. "Elena," Patricia said warmly, "you didn't need to attend." "I wanted to listen," I replied. The meeting unfolded exactly as I expected. Daniel deferred constantly. Patricia corrected him softly. Executives watched the dynamic, recalibrating in real time. No one addressed me directly. When I spoke, answers came filtered through Daniel, as if I were a consultant instead of the founder. Mini hook, though no one else noticed it. They stopped worrying about what I could do. By noon, I had a clear picture. They weren't just sidelining me. They were consolidating control. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. Her name was Marissa Klein. I'd hired her years earlier for an acquisition review. She specialized in corporate governance disputes and didn't waste time on sympathy. "Elena," she said after I explained, "this wasn't a takeover. It was a conversion." "Explain," I said. "They didn't steal your company," Marissa replied. "They domesticated it. Spousal authority, advisory manipulation, board conditioning. It's cleaner, harder to challenge emotionally, easier legally if documented." "Can I reverse it?" I asked. "Eventually," she said, but not loudly. "Not yet." I stared at the window. "What do I do now?" I asked. "You watch," Marissa said, "and you document." That night at home, Daniel acted relieved. He cooked dinner. He talked about how stressful leadership was. He thanked me for trusting him. Patricia joined us unexpectedly. She brought dessert and sat at the head of the table without asking. "Elena," she said, "I hope you understand how delicate this phase is." "I do," I replied. She smiled. "Good. Strong women sometimes forget that collaboration requires restraint." Restraint. I looked at Daniel. He nodded slightly, as if to encourage me to agree. I did. "I'll stay out of the way," I said. That sentence bought me access. Over the next 2 weeks, I became invisible by design. I didn't challenge decisions. I didn't attend optional meetings. I stopped offering unsolicited insights. I let Daniel and Patricia believe they'd stabilized the company. In reality, they were destabilizing it. Patricia pushed for aggressive growth in regulated states without updating compliance protocols. Daniel approved contracts without legal review. Financial approvals were routed through a new internal committee Patricia chaired unofficially. I logged everything: dates, emails, call summaries, Slack messages. Then I noticed something else. They were rewriting the origin story. In a company-wide meeting, Daniel referred to Larkspur as a joint effort. He thanked his mother publicly for her strategic vision. He described my role as foundational but complete. I watched faces in the room shift. History was being edited. Mini hook. When someone starts rewriting the past, they're preparing to justify the future. 3 weeks in, my access was reduced again. Read-only financial dashboards. Restricted HR permissions. Investor communications filtered through Daniel. But one thing they couldn't restrict without legal risk was audit access. Founders retained it by default. That was the clause Patricia hadn't noticed. At 11:43 p.m. one night, I logged into the audit trail. What I found wasn't criminal. It was worse. Conflicts of interest. Undisclosed advisory compensation. Patricia billing the company through a consulting LLC registered under her maiden name. Daniel approving payments without disclosure to the board. The amounts were small enough to hide, consistent enough to establish pattern. This wasn't about helping. It was about control with compensation. I slept 4 hours that night. The next morning, Daniel mentioned casually that Patricia had suggested revising my employment agreement. To protect you, he said. I nodded. Of course. That afternoon, I forwarded the audit logs to Marissa Klein. Her reply came back 10 minutes later. This is leverage. Not yet justice, but leverage. At dinner that night, Patricia looked pleased. You seem calmer, she said. Letting go suits you. I met her eyes. I'm not letting go. She laughed softly. Of course you are. I smiled back. That was the moment I understood the shape of the fight. They believed I was emotional, wounded, passive. They believed love had softened me. They didn't understand that the version of me they were dealing with now was quieter, because she was no longer asking permission. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was designing an outcome. And the first step wasn't exposing them. It was letting them commit fully. Because the more comfortable people get in power they didn't earn, the more carelessly they leave fingerprints. The first decision Daniel Brooks made without me wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve money, or layoffs, or public announcements. It was a calendar invite. At 7:06 a.m. on a Tuesday, my phone buzzed with an automated notification from Larkspur's internal system. Daniel had scheduled a leadership offsite for the executive team and the board. 2 days. Aspen. Strategic realignment. My name wasn't on the invite. Patricia Brooks was. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because it hurt, but because it clarified something I'd been circling for weeks. They weren't just removing my authority. They were rehearsing a future where my absence felt normal. I forwarded the invite to Marissa Klein with a single line. They're formalizing it. Her reply came back within minutes. Good. Let them. I didn't respond to the calendar notice. I didn't ask questions. I didn't signal awareness. Instead, I went to the office early and sat in the quiet of my old corner office, now technically shared, and listened. Executives talk when they think you're no longer relevant. They vent. They speculate. They explain themselves out loud. By noon, I knew what the Aspen retreat was really about. Patricia had convinced Daniel that investors needed reassurance, a clean story, a clear face of leadership. The offsite would be used to align messaging before the next funding round. Translation: erase ambiguity. Erase me. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by my office. He leaned against the doorframe the way he used to when we were dating, trying to soften what he was about to say. You saw the offsite invite, he said. Yes. It's not personal, he added quickly. It's just optics. Optics. Another word that made decisions for me. I understand, I said. He exhaled, relieved. You've been amazing about this. I smiled faintly. Have I? He didn't catch the edge in my voice. Mom thinks it'll help if you take some real time off, he continued. Disconnect. Reset. I'll think about it, I said. That evening, Patricia joined us again for dinner. She wore a tailored gray dress and carried a leather notebook like a badge. Elena, she said, settling in, we'll be discussing governance adjustments at the retreat. I'm sure, I replied. She smiled. You don't need to worry about the details. I don't, I said, and I meant it. Mini hook. When people stop worrying about your reaction, they start revealing their intentions. 2 days later, as Daniel and Patricia flew to Aspen, I stayed in Denver and did something I hadn't done since the earliest days of Larkspur. I audited our client contracts manually, not summaries, originals. At first, it was routine. Then I noticed anomalies. New addenda added to long-standing agreements, clauses referencing advisory oversight. Patricia's Consulting LLC listed as a compliance reviewer on 3 hospital networks. She'd embedded herself into revenue streams. That wasn't just unethical. It was risky. In healthcare analytics, conflicts of interest trigger audits. Audits trigger penalties. Penalties kill funding rounds. Patricia knew this, which meant she was betting on something else. Control. I printed everything. That afternoon, Marissa and I met in person. This is escalating, Marissa said, flipping through the documents. She's not just advising, she's monetizing influence. And Daniel's approving it, I said. Yes, Marissa replied. Which exposes him, too. I nodded slowly. Good. Marissa studied me. You're not angry. I'm focused, I said. There's a difference. She closed the folder. The board doesn't know. They will, I said. But not yet. That night, Daniel called from Aspen. You'd love it here, he said. So calm, productive. How's the retreat going? I asked. Great, he said. We're aligning. On what? I asked gently. There was a pause. The future. Whose? I asked. He laughed awkwardly. Ours. When he hung up, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt unburdened. The next morning, I received a forwarded email by accident. Daniel hadn't meant to include me. It was from Victor Hale, the board chair. We need to discuss Elena's long-term role. Investors are asking. Patricia replied within minutes. She's transitioning beautifully. We should support her exit with dignity. Exit. There it was. Mini hook. The word that turns temporary into permanent. I forwarded the email chain to Marissa. Her response was immediate. They're setting up a removal narrative. We move soon. How soon? I asked. Before Aspen ends, she said. Or you lose leverage. I thought carefully. I need one more thing, I said. What? Proof. They believe I'm gone. That afternoon, I did something deliberate. I requested a leave of absence. 2 weeks. Medical. Stress-related. HR processed it within an hour. Patricia sent flowers. Daniel sent a text. I'm proud of you for taking care of yourself. That text told me everything. They believed I'd disengaged. They believed the company was theirs. That belief was about to cost them far more than they anticipated. Because the moment you convince yourself someone is no longer a threat is the moment you stop covering your tracks. And as Aspen continued, decisions were made, approvals given, lines crossed. I watched it all happen from a distance I'd chosen. The mistake happened on the second morning in Aspen. I know the exact timing because the approval notification hit my phone at 9:14 a.m. Routed automatically through the audit system, they forgot I still had access to. Subject: Executive authorization confirmed. Daniel Brooks had approved a data bridging pilot with a hospital network in Nevada. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't have raised concern. Larkspur was built for compliance-heavy environments. We moved carefully, deliberately, always one step ahead of regulators. But Nevada wasn't a normal expansion. Nevada required a specific patient data handling certification that Larkspur did not yet hold. We were approved in Colorado, Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. Nevada was pending. Everyone in leadership knew that. Everyone except the people who thought authority replaced understanding. I opened the document slowly. The pilot agreement was signed by Daniel, reviewed by Patricia Brooks through her Consulting LLC. No legal sign-off, no compliance approval, no contingency language. Worse, the hospital network was partially state-funded. That meant oversight. That meant exposure. I didn't react immediately. I didn't forward it. I didn't flag it. I waited. Because this wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern completing itself. Over the next 48 hours, More approvals followed. Minor changes, accelerated timelines, Patricia pushing to prove momentum before the funding round. Each decision shaved off safeguards I had built deliberately over years. I logged every one. Meanwhile, at home, Daniel acted lighter than I'd seen him in months. He called every night from Aspen, excited, energized. People finally see the vision, he said. They see where this company can go. Our vision? I asked once. Yes, he replied, without hesitation. He meant his. By the time the retreat ended, they'd finalized a restructuring proposal. I wasn't copied. But Victor Hale, the board chair, accidentally forwarded it to the wrong alias, mine. The proposal outlined a phased leadership transition. Daniel as permanent CEO, Patricia as chief strategic advisor under a consulting arrangement. My role redefined as founder emeritus. Emeritus, a word used for people who are done, but too awkward to dismiss outright. I forwarded the document to Marissa Klein with no commentary. She called me immediately. They've overreached, she said. This is actionable. Not yet, I replied. I want them comfortable. Marissa paused. Elena, you're giving them rope. Yes, I said, and they're tying it themselves. That weekend, I attended my leave of absence appointment. I sat in a quiet office while a physician I'd never met asked generic questions about stress and sleep. I answered honestly enough to qualify. 2 weeks approved. Documentation filed. Patricia forwarded it to the board as proof of my fragility. I knew because I saw the email. She needs time, Patricia wrote. We should respect her health. Health had become the justification for control. On Monday, I sent a single email to the compliance director. Her name was Renee Wallace, and she'd been with Larkspur since our second year. She trusted me. She also trusted process more than people. Subject: quick clarification needed. I asked one question. Are we currently certified to operate pilot programs involving state-funded hospitals in Nevada? Her reply came back within minutes. No, we are not. Why? I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded her the pilot agreement. Her next email was not casual. This approval should not have happened. Correct. By Tuesday afternoon, Renee had escalated internally. Daniel tried to intercept it. Patricia suggested it was a misunderstanding. They scheduled an emergency internal review. I wasn't invited. That was fine. Because by Wednesday, the hospital network had flagged the same issue on their end. They contacted Larkspur's legal team directly. Not Daniel, not Patricia. Legal. The tone shifted immediately. I could feel it without being in the room. Daniel called me that night. Elena, he said, voice tight. Did you know about this Nevada issue? Yes, I replied. Why didn't you say anything? He asked. I wasn't asked, I said calmly. There was a long silence. This could delay the funding round, he said. Yes, I replied. It could. Patricia took the phone. Elena, she said, still composed. This is why we wanted you to rest. You're seeing risk everywhere. I'm seeing compliance, I said. There's a difference. You're overreacting, she said. No, I replied. I'm underreacting, deliberately. She didn't respond. The next day, the board convened without Aspen Energy and without illusion. Renee Wallace presented her findings. So did legal. The Nevada pilot was suspended. Investors were notified. Questions were asked. Daniel tried to explain. Patricia reframed. No one mentioned me, but my absence was suddenly noticeable. Victor Hale emailed me directly, for the first time in weeks. We need to talk, I replied with a single line. I'm available Friday. That Friday, I sat at the head of the table again, not because they invited me back, because the room needed someone who understood the system. Daniel looked exhausted. Patricia looked irritated. I looked calm. Victor cleared his throat. Elena, he said. We underestimated your institutional knowledge. I nodded. You underestimated the system I built. No one argued. That meeting didn't restore my authority. It did something better. It cracked their certainty. As I left the building, I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned, because now they knew something critical. I wasn't gone. I was waiting. And the more they tried to operate without me, the more visible the cost became. They didn't call it an apology. They called it a conversation. Victor Hale, the board chair, sent the invite late Friday afternoon. Carefully worded, carefully neutral. Alignment discussion. Path forward. Leadership clarity. Daniel Brooks was included. Patricia Brooks was included. I was listed last. I accepted within 5 minutes. The meeting took place the following Tuesday in the same conference room where I'd been quietly sidelined months earlier. Same glass walls, same long table, different posture. Daniel sat with his hands folded, shoulders tense. Patricia sat upright, chin lifted, pen resting precisely on her legal pad like a boundary marker. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. Victor opened with practiced concern. We all agree the Nevada situation exposed gaps. It exposed decisions made without compliance, I said. There's a difference. Patricia smiled thinly. We were moving fast. You were moving unqualified, I replied. Daniel shifted. Elena, we've acknowledged the misstep. Have you? I asked calmly. Because the pilot agreement was approved, payments were authorized, and my access was restricted while that happened. Silence followed. Mini hook. Silence doesn't mean disagreement when no one can contradict you. Victor cleared his throat. What are you asking for, Elena? Clarity, I said. On authority, accountability, and conflict of interest. Patricia's pen stopped moving. I want governance restored to what the operating agreement intended, I continued. Founder authority over compliance, independent review of all advisory compensation, and a pause on any restructuring until the audit is complete. Daniel looked at Patricia before responding. That feels reactive. No, I said. It's corrective. Patricia finally spoke. You're punishing us for initiative. I met her eyes. I'm containing risk created by overreach. Her smile faded. Victor leaned back. If we agree, what do you give in return? That question told me everything. They still thought this was a negotiation. I don't trade stability, I said. I provide it. Daniel exhaled sharply. You can't just walk back in like nothing happened. I didn't walk back in, I replied. You invited me because the system faltered without me. That landed harder than I expected. Patricia gathered herself. Elena, let's be honest. This company needs decisive leadership. Yes, I agreed. And decisive leadership requires informed restraint, not familial consensus. Her jaw tightened. Victor nodded slowly. We'll need time to consider. Of course, I said. But while you consider, all advisory payments are paused. Patricia snapped her pen shut. That's inappropriate. It's prudent, I replied, and within founder authority. Daniel looked at Victor. Is that accurate? Victor hesitated, then nodded. It is. That was the moment the room shifted. Not because I'd won, because they realized how much they'd assumed. The meeting adjourned without resolution, which was fine, because the next phase didn't require agreement. It required exposure. That afternoon, I met Marissa Klein at her office. They're cornered, she said after I summarized, but they're not done. I know, I replied. Patricia won't concede quietly. No, Marissa agreed. People who mistake control for competence rarely do. We reviewed the audit timeline. Compliance findings. Advisory compensation disclosures. Everything aligned toward a single conclusion. Patricia Brooks had crossed a line that couldn't be reframed as mentorship, and Daniel had enabled it. At home that night, Daniel tried a different approach. He cooked. He poured wine. He sat closer than he had in weeks. You didn't have to be so cold, he said. I wasn't cold, I replied. I was precise. He sighed. This is tearing us apart. No, I said quietly. This is revealing where we were already split. He looked at me, searching. Do you even want to fix this? I considered the question honestly. I want honesty, I said. If fixing this requires pretending nothing happened, then no. He leaned back. Mom says you're enjoying this. That hurt less than it should have. Your mother believes conflict only exists when she's not controlling it, I said. That's not enjoyment. That's clarity. He didn't respond. 2 days later, the audit findings were delivered. Not publicly. Internal. They were clinical, methodical, unemotional. Undisclosed compensation. Improper approval routing. Governance bypass. No accusations, just facts. Victor called me that evening. We need to move quickly, he said. Yes, I replied. You do. We're suspending Patricia's advisory role pending review. That's appropriate, I said. And Daniel? He asked. That's your decision, I replied. But accountability isn't divisible. There was a pause. I understand, Victor said. That night, Daniel came home late. He didn't take off his jacket. They're asking me to step aside, he said, temporarily. I nodded. That's consistent. You pushed this, he said. I didn't, I replied. I documented it. He stared at me. So what now? Now. That word used to scare me. Now, it felt neutral. Now you decide who you are without your mother managing outcomes, I said. And without me cushioning consequences. He sank into a chair. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. I know, I replied. You just didn't mind benefiting. That was the truest sentence I'd spoken in weeks. If you're listening to this and you've ever been told to soften your response so someone else can avoid discomfort, pause here. Like this story. Subscribe if you want to hear how quiet accountability unfolds. And remember that clarity often feels cruel only to people who depended on confusion. By the end of that week, Patricia Brooks was officially removed from all company involvement. Daniel Brooks took a leave of absence. The board requested my return as interim CEO. I didn't answer immediately because stepping back in wasn't the same as stepping forward. And the next move I made wouldn't be about restoring what was taken. It would be about deciding what was worth keeping. I didn't answer the board's request for 48 hours, not because I was unsure, because I needed to hear what silence would bring out in everyone else. In those 2 days, I learned more than I had in the previous 6 months. Victor Hale called once, then didn't call again. He understood leverage when he felt it. 2 board members emailed privately, careful not to sound eager, asking what support I would need if I returned. One investor sent a single line: stability matters more than optics. Daniel Brooks didn't contact me at all. That absence said everything. On the 3rd morning, I walked back into Larkspur Health Systems as if nothing had changed. Because for me, nothing had. The same receptionist looked up, surprised, then smiled with relief. The same elevator hummed. The same 4th-floor glass reflected a version of me that felt sharper, more intact. I sat in the conference room alone for 10 minutes before the board arrived. When they did, I stood. I'll accept interim CEO, I said before anyone spoke. With conditions. Victor nodded. We expected that. Founder authority restored in full, I continued. Independent compliance reporting directly to me. No family involvement in any capacity. And Daniel Brooks removed from executive decision-making until the investigation concludes. A pause. One board member shifted. He's still your husband. Yes, I said. That's why he can't stay. No one argued. Because at that point, argument would have sounded unserious. The vote was unanimous. By noon, my access was fully restored. By 3, the announcement went out. Founder, Elena Brooks, appointed interim CEO to guide Larkspur through governance review. It was intentionally bland. Power rarely needs adjectives. That evening, Daniel came home early. He stood in the doorway, watching me read emails at the kitchen table. So it's official, he said. Yes. He sat across from me. You didn't tell me. I didn't need to, I replied. His jaw tightened. You didn't even ask how I felt. I closed my laptop. Daniel, I said, you approved decisions that put the company at risk while my authority was restricted. You allowed your mother to profit from influence. You benefited from my absence. What part of that required checking in? He looked away. They're treating me like I did something wrong, he said. They're treating you like an executive, I replied. Executives are accountable. That's not how families work, he snapped. No, I said quietly. That's how systems work. And we're inside one now. He didn't speak for a long time. I need space, he said finally. Yes, I replied. You do. He packed a bag that night and left without drama. I didn't stop him. The next week was surgical. I reinstated protocols, froze risky expansions, initiated third-party compliance review, reassigned teams Patricia had influenced, sent clear, calm communication to investors and clients. No blame, no spectacle, just correction. Employees noticed immediately. Meetings ran tighter. Decisions slowed just enough to be defensible. People who'd been uneasy under Patricia's shadow relaxed. One engineer stopped me in the hallway. It feels like the company again, she said. That mattered. On Friday, Marissa Klein came by my office. They're asking about next steps, she said. Legally. With Daniel? I asked. Yes. I leaned back. Draft separation terms. Marissa nodded. And personally, I thought about Daniel's face at the table, the way he'd deferred, the way he'd benefited, the way he'd never said, stop. I don't want revenge, I said. I want clean lines. That afternoon, I received an email from Patricia Brooks. It was brief. You've humiliated us. Families don't do this to each other. I didn't reply, because families also don't siphon control and call it love. The investigation concluded the following week. No criminal findings, clear governance violations, recommendations for structural reform. Daniel's leave became permanent. The board asked if I wanted the CEO role full-time. I asked for one night to think. That night, alone in our apartment, I walked through rooms that suddenly felt neutral. Not sad, not angry, just transitional. I realized something then. I didn't want to prove anything anymore. I wanted to build without interference. The next morning, I accepted the role. CEO, founder, final authority, no qualifiers. Daniel emailed me once more. I didn't know it would end like this. I replied with one line. Neither did I. But here we are. If you've ever had to choose between keeping a relationship intact and keeping yourself intact, pause here. Like this story. Subscribe if you want to hear how the last layers fall away. And remember, choosing yourself doesn't mean you never loved them. It means you stopped disappearing for them. The cost didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, unglamorous moments that followed me through the days after Daniel Brooks moved out. An empty drawer. A second toothbrush, gone. The silence, where commentary used to be. I didn't miss him the way people expect you to miss a husband. I missed the idea that love had protected me. That illusion took longer to release. Daniel's absence was clean. No begging, no shouting, no dramatic texts at midnight. He left like a man who still believed this was temporary. Like space was a strategy instead of a consequence. The first legal document arrived 3 days later. Marissa Klein sent it to me before Daniel did. Petition for marital dissolution, filed in Denver County. Cited irreconcilable differences. No mention of Larkspur, no accusations, no drama. Daniel was still trying to keep things polite. That told me he hadn't understood yet. At work, the company stabilized faster than anyone expected. Clients responded positively to the pause on expansion. Investors appreciated the clarity. Compliance audits closed without escalation. Revenue dipped slightly, then leveled. What surprised me was how quickly people adjusted to my leadership again, not with celebration, with relief. Employees stopped checking over their shoulders. Meetings ended with decisions instead of deferments. The company's nervous energy evaporated. Patricia Brooks had left a residue. Now, it was gone. The board scheduled a public-facing update call. Not a press release, not an announcement, a controlled briefing. I led it. I didn't mention my marriage. I didn't mention Patricia. I didn't mention the Nevada pilot. I talked about governance, safeguards, long-term vision. At the end, Victor Hale thanked me for steering the company through instability. Instability, that word used to scare me. Now it felt accurate. After the call, Renee Wallace stopped by my office. "Can I say something off the record?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "When they pushed you out," she said carefully, "a lot of us stayed because we hoped you'd come back." I nodded. "Thank you for staying." She hesitated. "Some people won't." "I know," I said, and that was fine. Systems correct themselves, not by force, but by alignment. That weekend, Daniel came by to collect the rest of his things. He texted first. "I'll be there at 10. He arrived at 10 on the dot. We didn't hug. We didn't argue. He walked through the apartment like a guest who recognized the furniture but no longer belonged to the space. At the kitchen counter, he paused. "You didn't fight the divorce," he said. "No," I replied. "That hurt," he admitted. I looked at him. "You thought resistance meant caring," I said. "I learned it doesn't." He swallowed. "My mom says you planned this." I smiled slightly. "Your mother believes women don't leave unless they're plotting." He didn't laugh. "I never wanted to take anything from you," he said. "I know," I replied. "You just didn't mind when it happened." That was the sentence that ended us. He nodded once, quietly. "I don't recognize you anymore," he said. I recognized myself clearly for the first time. I replied. When he left, I locked the door and stood still for a long moment, not grieving, recalibrating. The following week, Patricia Brooks tried once more. Not directly. She sent an email to the board, questioning my leadership style. Framed it as concern. Emotional volatility. Unresolved personal matters. Victor forwarded it to me. No commentary. I replied with documentation. Audit results. Compliance reports. Investor confidence metrics. Revenue projections. Facts don't argue. They replace. Patricia's email disappeared from the conversation. That was the last time she reached for institutional power. Privately, she left a voicemail. Elena, she said, voice tight, you could have been part of this family forever. I deleted it without listening again. Because families don't extract obedience and call it belonging. Marissa finalized the divorce terms quickly. No contest, no claims, no spousal interest in Larkspur. Daniel signed everything. He kept the car. I kept the company. That felt fair. One night, sitting alone with takeout and a glass of wine, I noticed something unexpected. I was calm. Not numb, calm. The phrase that kept surfacing in my mind was the same one that had carried me through the worst of it. I am not panicking. I said it out loud. And I realized something else. Revenge isn't loud when it's effective. It looks like competence. It looks like consequences. It looks like people slowly understanding that you were never emotional, just underestimated. The next phase wasn't about punishing Daniel or Patricia. They'd already lost what they valued most: control. The next phase was about me deciding what to build without interference. And I wasn't done yet, because something still needed to happen. Not legally, personally. A final conversation. Not with Daniel, not with Patricia, but with the version of myself that had accepted small erasures for the sake of peace. The habit didn't announce itself. It didn't come with fear or doubt or the urge to apologize. It showed up as efficiency. 3 weeks after the divorce papers were filed, my calendar was full again. Not with fires, not with recovery work, but with opportunity, strategic calls, acquisition interest, invitations to speak on panels I'd once declined because someone else needed me home. I accepted almost all of them. That was the habit, filling the space before anyone else could. I noticed it one night when I stayed at the office past 9 for no real reason, rereading a presentation I already knew by heart. The building was quiet. The city lights reflected off the glass. I could have gone home hours earlier. Instead, I stayed. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of being still. That realization landed harder than any board confrontation ever had. The next morning, my executive assistant, Monica Reyes, knocked lightly on my office door. "Your schedule is tight next week," she said. "Do you want me to move the Boston trip?" "No," I replied automatically. She hesitated. "You haven't taken a real day off since before everything." I looked at her then. Monica wasn't prying. She wasn't judging. She was observing. "Cancel the Friday meetings," I said after a moment. "Keep Monday." She smiled, surprised but professional. "Done." That Friday, I stayed home. No laptop, no calls, no plans. I cleaned the apartment slowly, threw out things that no longer felt like mine, donated clothes I'd worn to fit a version of myself that negotiated constantly. In the back of the closet, I found a box. It was labeled Larkspur Early. Sharpie. My handwriting. Inside were old notebooks, pitch drafts, early financial models, notes from nights when the company was nothing but an idea and stubbornness. On the inside cover of the first notebook, I'd written a sentence in uneven ink. "If I ever make myself smaller to keep something, it isn't worth keeping." I sat on the floor and read that line 3 times. I hadn't forgotten who I was. I'd just postponed her. That afternoon, Marissa Klein called. "I got a request," she said, "from Daniel's attorney." I closed my eyes briefly. "What does he want?" "A clarification," she replied. "He's asking for language that publicly acknowledges his contributions to Larkspur during the marriage." I didn't respond right away. "That's optional," Marissa added. "You don't owe it." "I know," I said. I thought about Daniel. The way he'd stepped into authority without asking. The way he deferred upward instead of inward. The way he'd benefited without stopping it. "He didn't build the company," I said, "but he was there." Marissa waited. "I'll acknowledge support," I said finally, not leadership. She smiled through the phone. That's clean. That choice mattered, not because it helped Daniel, because it aligned me. The following week, I declined 2 speaking engagements and accepted one instead. A closed-room roundtable with other founders who'd navigated governance crises. No stage, no applause, just conversation. One woman across the table, a biotech CEO from Seattle, listened quietly as I explained the situation in neutral terms. At the end, she said, "You didn't lose your company. You lost your tolerance for distortion." That sentence stayed with me. Back at Larkspur, things continued to stabilize. We closed a long-delayed contract with a Midwest hospital group, hired 2 senior engineers, passed a surprise regulatory review without comment. The company didn't need heroics. It needed consistency. One afternoon, Renee Wallace stopped by again. "I wanted you to know," she said. "People feel safer asking questions now." I nodded. "That's the goal." She hesitated. "It's different when the person in charge doesn't need to perform authority." I understood exactly what she meant. Authority doesn't have to announce itself when it's grounded. That evening, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. It was Patricia Brooks. I didn't know how she'd gotten the number. I didn't ask. "You may have won professionally, but you lost your family." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then I deleted the message, because winning had nothing to do with it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt complete. That night, sitting on the balcony with a glass of water, I made a decision that surprised even me. I blocked her number. Not out of anger, out of closure. You don't keep doors unlocked when you've decided who's allowed inside. The habit I'd been carrying wasn't fear. It was availability. I'd been available to explain, to soften, to accommodate, to absorb. Letting go of that didn't make me harder. It made me precise. Chapter 8 wasn't about confrontation. It was about subtraction. Removing the reflex to earn peace by staying busy. Removing the need to prove legitimacy through exhaustion. Removing the belief that silence had to be filled. By the end of that week, I felt something settle into place. Not confidence, ownership. Because the last thing anyone can take from you is the boundary you enforce without apology. And the next chapter wouldn't be about rebuilding. It would be about something much more dangerous to the people who underestimated me. Visibility. Not the kind you seek. The kind you can no longer avoid. Visibility didn't arrive the way I expected. There was no headline, no sudden spike in attention, no moment where I felt seen in the cinematic sense people imagine when they talk about success after betrayal. It came as a request. A single email forwarded by my executive assistant, Monica Reyes, marked urgent, but written carefully enough to pretend it wasn't. Subject: Invitation to testify. Senate Health Data Oversight Hearing. I read it twice before it settled. The request came from the Colorado State Senate Committee on Health and Technology. They were holding a public hearing on patient data compliance, third-party analytics vendors, and governance failures in private healthcare tech companies. Larkspur Health Systems was cited as a case study, not because of scandal, because we had stopped one. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. This was the part Patricia Brooks would have loved. The optics, the influence, the seat at the table. She would have coached Daniel on how to speak. She would have framed it as legacy. Instead, the invitation was addressed to me alone. Elena Brooks, founder and chief executive officer. No marital title, no family context, just authorship. I called Marissa Klein first. "You should do it," she said without hesitation. "I know," I replied. "I'm just deciding how." "Truthfully," she said, "that's what they want." That afternoon, the board convened briefly to discuss the request. Victor Hale didn't waste time. "This puts us in a spotlight," he said. "Yes," I replied, "but it's a controlled one." One board member asked the obvious question. "Will this reopen questions about governance?" "No," I said. "It will close them." I accepted the invitation that night. The hearing was scheduled for early December. Public, recorded, archived. Visibility that doesn't go away. The preparation was meticulous. No dramatics, no personal grievances, just timelines, frameworks, decisions. I didn't mention Patricia. I didn't mention Daniel. I talked about what happens when advisory influence replaces accountability, when personal trust is mistaken for governance, when founders step back without safeguards. I talked about systems. That was my language. The day of the hearing, I sat alone at the witness table, a glass of water to my right, my notes untouched. The room was full. Not with spectators. With attention. The committee chair, Senator Margaret Ellis, opened with a direct question. Ms. Brooks, your company avoided regulatory penalties during a period of internal upheaval. How? I didn't pause. By restoring clear authority, I said, and removing conflicted influence. Was that difficult? She asked. Yes, I replied. But necessary. She nodded. Did personal relationships complicate that process? Yes, I said, again. Would you do it differently? I considered the question carefully. No, I said. I would do it sooner. There was a murmur in the room. Mini hook. Unspoken but real. People leaned forward when they realized I wasn't protecting anyone. After the hearing, requests followed. Panels, advisory boards, editorial interviews. I declined most. I accepted one. A long-form interview with the National Business Journal focused on governance and leadership under pressure. Not revenge. Not drama. Structure. The journalist asked me a question near the end. Do you believe betrayal made you a better leader? I shook my head slightly. No, I said. Clarity did. Betrayal just removed the distractions. The article ran 2 weeks later. It didn't mention my marriage. It didn't mention my mother-in-law. It mentioned Larkspur Health Systems as a model for governance recovery. Patricia Brooks called the office the same day. Monica didn't put the call through. She forwarded me a message instead. Caller identified as Patricia Brooks. Requested comment on article. I deleted it. Because visibility isn't an invitation. It's a consequence. Daniel emailed once more after the article published. I read it without emotion. I didn't recognize myself in what you said, but I recognize that you were honest. I replied with one sentence. Honesty doesn't require recognition. That was the end of our correspondence. If you're listening to this, and you've ever been told to stay quiet so someone else could stay comfortable, pause here. Like the story. Subscribe if you want more real family drama, real revenge, and real consequences. And if you've been erased politely, leave a comment. You don't have to explain. Just mark that you're still here. By the end of the year, Larkspur closed its strongest quarter on record. Revenue wasn't explosive. Retention was. People stayed. Clients renewed. Employees referred friends. Stability compounds quietly. One evening, after the office had emptied, I stood at the window and looked down at the city. I thought about the woman I'd been at that dining table months earlier, nodding while someone slid papers toward her. I didn't feel anger toward her. I felt gratitude. She stayed still long enough to see the pattern. Visibility hadn't exposed me. It had protected me. Because when the truth is boring and consistent, it's very hard to discredit. Chapter 9 ended with my voice entering a room it had never needed before. Chapter 10 would begin with what happens after the world believes you, and whether you still need it to. Belief is heavier than doubt. I learned that in the weeks after the article ran, when people stopped asking if I could lead and started assuming I would, the difference mattered. It showed up in meetings that skipped explanations, in invitations that arrived already decided, in expectations that no longer came with contingency plans. The world didn't clap, it leaned. And leaning creates pressure. At Larkspur Health Systems, growth opportunities multiplied. Not reckless ones, structured ones. Hospital groups that had watched quietly during the governance chaos now wanted long-term contracts. State agencies requested demonstrations. A national insurer asked for a pilot that would have terrified me a year earlier. I didn't say yes immediately. That restraint surprised people. Victor Hale mentioned it during a board check-in. You're leaving money on the table. I'm choosing timing, I replied. There's a difference. He nodded. He'd learned not to argue with that tone. At home, the apartment felt settled. Not empty. Settled. I rearranged furniture without negotiating. Chose colors without compromise. Bought a chair because I liked how it looked in the light, not because it matched anything else. Small autonomy accumulates. Daniel Brooks didn't appear in my life anymore. Not physically, not digitally. His name stopped arriving in my inbox. Mutual friends adjusted without commentary. The absence was complete enough that it felt intentional. Patricia Brooks tried once more, not through me, through reputation. A former colleague forwarded me a message from a professional forum, anonymous, sharp, suggesting that my rise was opportunistic, that my testimony had been self-serving, that I'd weaponized governance language to mask personal vendettas. I read it once, then I closed the tab. Not because it wasn't irritating, because it wasn't influential. That was the real shift. The things that used to require response now required nothing. One evening, Marissa Klein came by my office unannounced. She did that sometimes when something wasn't urgent, but mattered. "I wanted to tell you," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "The case study from the hearing is being used in a corporate law seminar." I raised an eyebrow. As what? As an example of internal correction without litigation. I smiled faintly. "That sounds flattering." "It's accurate," she said. "You didn't burn anything down." "I didn't need to," I replied. That night, alone again, I thought about the word revenge. People use it loosely. They imagine satisfaction, spectacle, dominance. What I felt wasn't satisfaction. It was proportion. Everyone ended up where their decisions placed them. Daniel lost proximity to power he hadn't earned. Patricia lost influence she'd mistaken for entitlement. The board learned the cost of sidelining institutional knowledge. The company learned that stability doesn't come from hierarchy, but from clarity. And I learned something quieter. I didn't need to be believed to act. But once I was believed, I needed to choose what to carry. The real test of revenge isn't whether you can strike back. It's whether you can stop striking once balance is restored. A month later, I declined a keynote invitation that would have cemented my public image as a survivor CEO. I didn't want that narrative to calcify. I accepted instead a closed advisory role with a healthcare oversight nonprofit. No publicity, no branding, just work. That choice confused some people. Monica Reyes asked gently, "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "I don't need to be visible everywhere." She smiled. "That's new." "It's learned," I replied. Near the end of the year, the board asked me to consider succession planning, not because they wanted me gone, because they finally understood continuity. I began grooming 2 internal leaders, not replacements, anchors, people who asked hard questions. People who didn't flinch when authority didn't flatter them. One afternoon, while reviewing their progress, I realized something. I wasn't guarding power anymore. I was stewarding it. That distinction was everything. On a quiet Sunday, I took a long walk through the city, coat zipped, hands in pockets. The air was cold and clear, the kind of day that makes you honest with yourself. I thought about the moment at the dining table when Daniel slid that folder toward me. How close I'd come to believing compliance was survival. I didn't feel anger toward him now. I felt distance. Distance is what remains when attachment dissolves without resentment. As the year closed, I received one final message from Patricia Brooks, a letter, physical, forwarded by the doorman. I didn't open it. I returned it unopened with no note. Because when someone speaks only to reclaim relevance, silence is the most accurate reply. If you're listening and you've reached a place where people finally believe you, pause here. Like this story, subscribe if you want to hear how the ending holds, and ask yourself a quiet question. What would you choose if no one needed convincing anymore? Chapter 10 didn't end with victory. It ended with discernment. And that made the final chapter inevitable. Because the last thing left to decide wasn't what I'd taken back. It was what I was ready to release. Release isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with declarations or final speeches. It arrives quietly, usually disguised as a choice you no longer feel compelled to justify. I noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon, months after the Senate hearing, when a junior analyst asked me a question I used to answer automatically. "Do you want to review this personally?" she asked, hovering in my doorway with a tablet in hand. The old version of me would have said yes without thinking. Oversight had once felt like safety. Control had felt like responsibility. This time, I looked at the document once, then shook my head. "No," I said. "You're ready." She smiled, surprised, and walked away. That was release. At Larkspur Health Systems, things were no longer fragile. They were functional. The systems I'd rebuilt held without constant reinforcement. The people I'd elevated didn't need approval to act. They needed clarity, and they had it. I spent less time solving problems and more time noticing which ones no longer appeared. That absence told me more than any report. The board meetings grew shorter, not because there was less to discuss, but because trust reduces redundancy. Victor Hale stopped framing decisions cautiously around my reactions. He spoke plainly. Others followed. One afternoon, after a meeting ended early, Victor lingered. "You know," he said, adjusting his jacket, "this company feels different now." "Yes," I replied. "Not just stable," he added. "Resilient." I nodded. "Because it isn't built around one person anymore." He studied me for a moment. "That's not how most founders talk." "I didn't always," I said. At home, my life had also thinned out, in a good way. Fewer obligations, fewer explanations, fewer people who needed reassurance. The apartment felt like a place I lived in, not a place I recovered in. One evening, I found myself cooking dinner without background noise. No podcast, no calls, just the sound of chopping vegetables and water boiling. It struck me then how often I used to fill silence to avoid hearing myself think. That reflex was gone. Daniel Brooks crossed my mind less often now. When he did, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with curiosity. The kind reserved for chapters you've closed, but still remember reading. Patricia Brooks didn't cross my mind at all. The release I hadn't anticipated came through my mother. We'd been cordial but distant since everything happened. She'd chosen neutrality over confrontation, which I'd accepted without endorsement. She called one afternoon and asked if we could meet. We chose a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. Neutral ground, but familiar enough to feel intentional. She arrived early. That was new. "Elena," she said, standing to hug me, then hesitating. I nodded. We sat. She stirred her coffee slowly before speaking. "I've been thinking about the way I raised you," she said. I waited. "I taught you to be capable," she continued. "But I also taught you to tolerate things you shouldn't." That was closer to accountability than I'd expected. "I didn't know how to protect you from people like Patricia," she said quietly. "So I taught you to manage them." I met her eyes. "I don't need you to apologize." She nodded. "I know." I needed to say it anyway. We sat in silence for a moment. Not awkward, just honest. "I'm proud of you," she said finally. "Not for winning. For stopping." Stopping. That word stayed with me. Stopping the explanations. Stopping the negotiations. Stopping the habit of overfunctioning so others wouldn't have to. That night, I wrote something down for the first time in months. Not a strategy, not a plan, a boundary. I will not rescue people from the consequences of choices they made while discounting mine. I didn't frame it. I didn't share it. I just kept it. At work, succession planning progressed. One of the leaders I'd been mentoring asked me a question I hadn't expected. "What happens if you leave?" she asked. I smiled. "Then the system should still work. And if it doesn't, then I didn't finish my job," I replied. That was the clearest definition of leadership I'd ever articulated. Late one evening, as I prepared to leave the office, Monica Reyes stopped me. "There's something you should see," she said, holding out her phone. It was an announcement from a regional healthcare firm. Patricia Brooks had accepted an advisory role there. Not executive, not influential. Advisory. I read it once and handed the phone back. "That makes sense," I said. Monica watched me carefully. "Does it bother you?" "No," I replied. "It confirms something." "What?" "That control, without consent, always migrates until it's constrained." She nodded, even if she didn't fully understand. That was fine. Not everyone needs the full arc. The closer I came to the end of the year, the clearer one thing became. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not closure, not acknowledgement, not revenge. The release I'd been circling wasn't about letting go of anger. It was about letting go of vigilance. I no longer needed to watch my back, because the people behind me no longer held power over my direction. Chapter 11 didn't end with reconciliation. It ended with relief. The quiet kind that doesn't ask to be validated. And the final chapter wouldn't be about what I'd survived. It would be about what I chose to carry forward, deliberately and without apology. The ending didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a morning where nothing urgent needed my attention. No messages marked high priority. No meetings rearranged at the last minute. No quiet dread sitting in my chest as I scanned my calendar for conflicts that weren't mine to manage. That was how I knew the story was finished. Not because everything was perfect, because nothing was being taken from me anymore. On the first Monday of the new year, I arrived at Larkspur Health Systems later than usual. Not out of rebellion, out of trust. The company opened without me. Meetings started on time. Decisions were made, documented, and executed. I reviewed outcomes, not emergencies. At 10:30, I stepped into the boardroom for a scheduled update. Victor Hale nodded at me, relaxed. The agenda was short, clean, focused on the future. At the end, he asked a question that would have once felt loaded. "Where do you see yourself in 5 years, Elena?" I didn't answer immediately. "I see myself optional," I said finally. "Not absent, not indispensable, just optional." The room was quiet. "That's a strong position," Victor said. "It's an honest one," I replied. Later that day, I signed the final version of the long-term governance charter. It codified everything I'd rebuilt. Clear authority lines, mandatory conflict disclosures, founder protections that didn't depend on goodwill. I signed it once. That was enough. When I left the office, the air was cold and bright. Denver winters have a way of stripping things down to essentials. The sky doesn't soften, it clarifies. I walked home instead of taking a car. At my apartment, I paused before unlocking the door and noticed something small. I wasn't bracing myself. Inside, the space felt lived in, not curated, not staged for anyone else's comfort. I cooked dinner without checking my phone, ate slowly, let the quiet stretch without filling it. That night, I thought about Daniel Brooks for the first time in weeks, not with anger. With distance. I wondered if he'd learned anything, if he'd recognized the moment where deference turned into damage, if he'd understood that loyalty without boundaries isn't love, it's convenience. I didn't need answers. Some lessons don't need to be mutual to be complete. Patricia Brooks crossed my mind even more briefly. I imagined her in a new office, offering guidance that no one mistook for authority. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt proportion. People land where their patterns take them. The final thing I did that year was decline a high-profile interview, a glossy feature, a story framed as a comeback. I wrote back politely, "Thank you, but I'm not interested in narrating this chapter anymore," because the truth was simple. I hadn't come back from anything. I had stepped forward. If you've listened this far, and you've lived inside a family drama where control was disguised as care, where betrayal wore professional language, where you were told to be patient while your ground disappeared, pause here. Like this story if it resonated. Subscribe if you want more stories about revenge that doesn't scream, karma that doesn't rush, and justice that arrives late but accurate. And if you're comfortable, leave a comment. Not about what they did to you, about what you chose to stop doing for them. Because the sharpest form of revenge isn't punishment, it's precision. It's refusing to over-explain your boundaries. It's building a life so aligned that manipulation has nowhere to attach. I didn't win because they lost. I won because I stopped participating in a system that required my silence to function. That's the part no one warns you about. Freedom doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet. And once you recognize that quiet, you'll never trade it again. That's where my story ends. Not with reconciliation, not with vengeance, but with self-respect, intact. And that was the one thing no one could ever take from me again.